The Grand Council Hall on Celestis 5 station hummed with the sound of a dozen different species breathing recycled air. The adaptive lighting adjusted continuously to accommodate the various visual preferences of the delegates, creating an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of illumination that somehow managed to remain diplomatically neutral. This was by design. Everything about Celestis Phi was engineered for neutrality. From its position at the gravitational midpoint between three major galactic powers to the precise temperature maintained at the mathematical average of all council members' homeworld preferences. Captain Dylan Sebastian stood at rigid attention just inside the service entrance, his military posture betraying none of the tension coiling inside him. His eyes, however, scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived more than one ambush. The dark green of his utilitarian uniform stood in stark contrast to the ornate diplomatic attire of the various council delegates. He was clearly not what they had been expecting. "You're certain about this approach?" Lieutenant Ivy whispered at his side, her hand never straying far from where her sidearm would normally be holstered. Today, in accordance with council regulations, that space was conspicuously empty. "Diplomatic channels failed for 3 cycles," Dylan replied, keeping his voice low. "Time to try something new." Nick Vulov, the third member of their small contingent, shifted uncomfortably in his mechanic's coveralls. "Still don't see why you needed a handyman for this circus," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed a keen interest in the alien architecture surrounding them. The unexpected appearance of 3 humans, not in the flowing robes of diplomats but in the practical gear of frontline personnel, had caused a ripple of disquiet through the Grand Council. Protocols had been shattered, traditions upended. And now, as Dylan and his small team made their way toward the central speaking platform, he could feel the weight of 100 alien gazes. Council Liaison Grimmich, a Corfaxian whose translucent skin revealed the agitated pulsing of multiple hearts, hurried toward them. "Captain Sebastian," he chittered, mandibles clicking in distress. "This is most irregular. We were expecting the human diplomatic corps, not military personnel." "The diplomatic corps sends their regrets," Dylan replied smoothly. They felt this particular situation required a more experiential approach. Before Grimmich could respond, a hush fell over the assembly. Through the main entrance, the Laharian delegation had arrived. They moved like liquid shadow, 8-foot-tall predators with sleek, muscular bodies covered in dark, iridescent scales that shimmered between deep purple and midnight black depending on the light. Their eyes, vertical-pupiled and amber, scanned the room with the unnerving focus of apex hunters. Each possessed 4 arms, the upper pair ending in dexterous 6-fingered hands, the lower in retractable hooked claws that could disembowel a creature twice their size in seconds. At their head walked pack leader Vizara, instantly recognizable by the distinctive scarring across her left facial plate and the ceremonial gold bands encircling her upper right arm. Her movements were fluid, controlled, radiating power without wasting a single motion. Unlike the rest of her pack, who wore minimal combat harnesses, Vizara had donned formal armor, interlocking plates of some unknown metal that caught the light like oil on water. The various delegations, Zari, Avon, Virex, Sinian, and others, instinctively shifted away, creating a wide berth for the Laharians. It wasn't simply fear, Dylan noted, but a deeply ingrained respect for predatory species. The galaxy's political reality was an uncomfortable truth. Apex hunters commanded deference, even in supposedly enlightened diplomatic circles. Dylan felt rather than saw Lieutenant Ivy tensing beside him. He gave her a barely perceptible shake of his head. Not yet. Grimmich was moving again, his skin now pulsing a distressed shade of green. "We must proceed with introductions," he said, voice pitched higher than before. "The protocols are very clear when two Deathworld species meet in council for the first time." And there it was, the unspoken rule that had poisoned interspecies relations for generations. When predators met predators, one must establish dominance. One must bow. The council chambers fell into expectant silence as Vizara and her pack took their position opposite the human delegation. For a moment, no one moved. The air felt charged, as if the environmental systems themselves were holding their breath. Then Vizara's amber eyes locked with Dylan's blue ones. Something passed between them, a flicker of recognition. Perhaps. Or memory. The chamber seemed to dim around them as their gazes held, and for a moment, they were elsewhere entirely. The howling winds of MK-130 slashed at Dylan's thermal suit like invisible knives, each gust carrying ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin. The Category 9 ice world had been labeled uninhabitable for good reason. Surface temperatures during daylight hours hovered around 60 degrees. At night, they plummeted to 100 degrees. The atmosphere was technically breathable, if one didn't mind the sensation of frost forming inside one's lungs. He squinted through the swirling white chaos at the twisted metal corpse of the UES Harbinger. The research vessel had gone down hard, her port nacelle completely sheared off by whatever had struck them during descent. Emergency power flickered weakly through visible sections of the hull, but the navigation array was clearly offline, and the reactor housing showed signs of critical damage. "Hey, comms," he shouted over the howling wind. Lieutenant Ivy shook her head, snow already building up on her helmet despite the heating elements. "Nothing beyond short-range tactical. We're deaf and dumb, Captain." "Life signs?" 27 confirmed survivors, she reported. 4 critical. Dr. Mayhew is setting up a medical station in what's left of the mess hall. Environmental systems are failing compartment by compartment. Dylan nodded grimly. "And our friends?" Ivy's expression hardened. "Their ship came down approximately 3 kilometers east. Crash signature suggests similar damage pattern to ours. No communication attempts." "How many?" "Unknown. Their hull design makes thermal imaging inconclusive." Dylan turned to face the distant smudge on the horizon, all that could be seen of the downed Laharian vessel through the storm. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental. Both ships damaged in exactly the same way, both forced to make emergency landings on this frozen hell. Someone had wanted representatives of humanity and the Laharian packs in the same deadly arena. "We should strike first," Ivy said, voice low enough that the words barely carried to his ears. "We're injured, vulnerable. They'll see that as opportunity." Dylan understood her reasoning. The Laharians were infamous throughout known space. Apex predators evolved on a world that made Earth look like a garden paradise. Their society was built around pack structures, with strict dominance hierarchies and territorial imperatives that had translated all too effectively to interstellar politics. They didn't negotiate. They dominated. And yet, "They're injured too," he said finally, "and just as stranded." "All the more reason they'll attack," Ivy insisted. "Wounded predators are the most dangerous kind." Dylan's gaze returned to the Harbinger's damaged hull. "We don't have enough power to maintain life support beyond 72 hours. The Laharians are cold-blooded. This environment is even more lethal to them than it is to us. So we wait for them to freeze to death? I can live with that plan." "No," Dylan said, decision crystallizing. "Prep the comms array, short-range, unencrypted channel." Ivy stared at him. "Captain, with all due respect." "That's an order, Lieutenant. If we're all going to die here, I'd prefer to try something unexpected first. Inside the Laharian vessel." Pack leader Vizara ignored the pain radiating from her lower left arm where a support beam had crushed the bone during their violent landing. Around her, her pack moved with disciplined efficiency despite their injuries, securing systems and assessing damage. The news was universally grim. "A navigation is beyond repair," reported Karn, her second in command. "Reactor containment is holding for now, but the coolant systems are compromised. We have perhaps 3 day cycles before critical failure." Vizara absorbed this with outward calm, though her inner eyelids flickered, a sign of stress recognizable only to those who knew her well. The humans? Their vessel suffered comparable damage. We count perhaps 30 life forms. Their thermal signatures are already weakening. Weapons capabilities? Unknown. Their design specifications are not in our database. However, given the research designation of their vessel, likely minimal. Vizara flexed her claws, a habitual gesture when thinking. The humans complicated matters. Her people had been tracking rumors of a new predatory species for several cycles now. Mammals who had somehow survived an evolutionary crucible nearly as harsh as their own homeworld. The reports were contradictory. Some claimed humans were dangerously unpredictable, others that they possessed a bizarre tendency toward cooperation with non-predator species. The ship-to-ship message that had forced them down had been brief and untraceable. The future of Laharian-human relations requires empirical data. Provide it. And then both vessels had been struck by some kind of localized ion weapon, crippling their systems and forcing emergency landings on this frozen wasteland. Someone wanted to see what would happen when humans and Laharians met with no witnesses and no escape. "We should eliminate them quickly," Karn suggested, voicing the pack consensus. "They are weakened by the cold. We could—" A sharp tone cut through the ship's comm system. Vizara's head snapped toward the source. "What is that?" The communications officer looked up in surprise. "The humans are hailing us. Unencrypted channel. They're broadcasting in the clear." Shocked silence fell over the command center. To transmit in the clear was to expose vulnerability, frequencies, language patterns, voice identifiers. No predator species would willingly provide such advantages to a potential rival. "It's a trap," Karn hissed. "They seek to pinpoint our position for an attack." Vizara raised a hand for silence, her inner conflict invisible behind her composed exterior. Every instinct, every cycle of training screamed that the humans should be treated as prey or rivals, certainly not as potential allies. And yet, "We are already compromised by the cold," she said finally. "Our reactor will fail within 3 day cycles. The humans face the same constraints." She straightened. Decision made. "Open the channel." The human's voice filled the command center, surprisingly clear despite the atmospheric interference. "This is Captain Dylan Sebastian of the United Earthship Harbinger to the Laharian vessel. Our ships have been deliberately disabled and forced down on this world. We have 72 hours before our life support fails. You have similar or less time before the cold renders your crew non-functional. I propose a temporary alliance to maximize survival chances for both our species. We have engineering expertise that might benefit your repairs. You may have resources we lack. Respond on this frequency if you wish to discuss terms." The message ended. The command center remained silent, every Laharian processing this unprecedented development. "It's an admission of weakness," one officer finally said, disbelief evident in her tone. "It's a clever ploy," Karn countered. "They seek to draw us out, to learn our numbers and capabilities." Vizara considered the options, weighing survival against pride, instinct against necessity. "If they wish to attack," she said slowly, "they could simply wait. This cold will kill us before it kills them. She stepped toward the communications array. "Open the channel." As she spoke her response, Vizara couldn't know that this moment, this pragmatic choice made in extremity, would change the course of interspecies relations forever. "Captain Sebastian, this is Pack Leader Vizara. We are willing to discuss terms." The first meeting between the human and Laharian crews took place at a precisely calculated midpoint between the two vessels, a neutral ground established through mutual agreement. Both sides brought small delegations. Dylan, Lieutenant Ivy, and Nick Vulov representing the humans, Vizara, Karn, and a Laharian engineer named Sek for their side. The biting wind tore at them as they faced each other across 10 meters of ice-crusted ground. Each group standing beside portable heaters that created small bubbles of survivable temperature in the frozen wasteland. Dylan noted how the Laharians moved with an almost painful stiffness, their cold-blooded physiology clearly struggling with the environment. Despite this, they maintained a regal bearing, their amber eyes unblinking as they assessed the humans. "You propose cooperation," Vizara said without preamble, her voice carrying an undertone of harmonics that the translation software rendered as formal but guarded. "Define your terms." Dylan gestured to Nick. "My engineer has analyzed both our ship's damage patterns. The ion weapon that struck us targeted specific systems, navigation, long-range communications, and reactor cooling. The pattern suggests the perpetrator doesn't want us dead immediately, but rather stranded without possibility of rescue." "To what purpose?" Karn demanded, his larger frame and more elaborate scale patterns marking him as a high-ranking pack member. "That's what we intend to find out," Dylan replied. "But first, we need to stabilize both vessels. Your ship took heavier damage to its environmental systems, but your reactor containment appears more intact than ours. We propose a joint engineering effort, your expertise with reactor technology combined with our advanced environmental system designs." Vizara's inner eyelids flickered rapidly as she processed this. "You would allow our engineers access to your vessel?" "Under supervision," Lieutenant Ivy interjected, her tone making it clear she still had reservations about the entire plan. "Similarly, we would permit your technical personnel limited access to our systems," Vizara countered. "With equivalent supervision?" Dylan nodded. "Agreed, we begin immediately. This storm is intensifying and we'll lose mobility entirely if we wait much longer." What followed was perhaps the most unusual cooperative endeavor in recent galactic history. Humans and Laharians working side by side, initially in an atmosphere of rigid suspicion that gradually, almost imperceptibly, shifted towards something resembling professional respect. Nick Vulov found himself paired with Tsek, the Laharian engineer whose six-fingered hands proved remarkably adept at manipulating the delicate components of the human vessel's environmental control systems. "Hey, hand me the plasma cutter," Nick said, half buried in a maintenance shaft as he struggled to reach a damaged junction box. There was a moment's hesitation before the tool was pressed into his outstretched hand. Nick pulled himself back slightly to find Sek watching him with those unnerving amber eyes. "Your technology is kupun inefficient," the Laharian observed. "This junction could handle 40% more throughput with minimal redesign." Nick snorted. "Yeah, well, our ships are built by the lowest bidder. Corporate efficiency trumps engineering elegance every time." Sek's head tilted slightly, a gesture Nick was beginning to recognize as confusion or curiosity. "Your species deliberately constructs suboptimal technology for financial advantage?" "Welcome to humanity," Nick said with a wry smile. "We're full of contradictions." Meanwhile, on the Laharian vessel, Lieutenant Ivy found herself increasingly fascinated by the elegant brutality of their engineering philosophy. Every system served multiple purposes, Every component was designed to continue functioning even when partially destroyed. "Your people build for war," she observed to Karn, who had been assigned as her escort during her analysis of their communication systems. "We build for survival," he corrected, watching her closely as she examined a particular circuit configuration. "Our evolutionary history demanded redundancy." Ivy nodded thoughtfully. "Earth, too. Different pressures, similar outcomes." Karn made a sound that might have been skepticism. "Your species is young, unproven." "Maybe," Ivy conceded, "but we learn fast." The real breakthrough came on the third day, when both teams had made significant progress on repairs but still faced the critical issue of reactor stability. The Laharian vessel's cooling systems were failing faster than anticipated, while the human ship's containment field was showing signs of imminent collapse. "We need to redistribute power between the vessels," Dylan proposed during an emergency meeting held in the relative shelter of a natural ice formation midway between the ships. "Run a power conduit from our main battery to supplement your cooling systems, while your containment field generator supports ours." Vizara's expression remained impassive, but her posture had changed subtly over the days of cooperation, less rigid, more contemplative. "The technical challenge is considerable. The interfaces are incompatible." "We can make it work," Nick interjected. "Sek and I have been experimenting with adapter configurations. It's not elegant, but it should hold long enough to stabilize both reactors." A moment of silence followed as both leaders considered the implications. This would not be simple cooperation. This would be integration of their most critical systems, a level of trust unprecedented between their species. "If either side sabotages the connection," Karn pointed out, "both vessels lose containment, both crews die." "Exactly," Dylan said quietly. "Perfect symmetry of vulnerability. Neither side can betray the other without destroying themselves." Vizara's amber eyes fixed on Dylan with new intensity. "You engineered this solution deliberately." It wasn't a question, but Dylan answered anyway. "I recognized an opportunity. Our species have been circling each other like wary predators since first contact. Someone orchestrated this situation to force conflict between us. I'm suggesting we disappoint them." The plan was approved, though not without resistance from both crews. The power integration required hours of delicate work, with Nick and Sek coordinating teams at both ends of a hastily constructed power conduit that stretched across the frozen landscape between the ships. As they worked, the storm that had been building for days finally unleashed its full fury. Winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour drove ice particles that cut like glass. Visibility dropped to near zero. Communication became impossible except at shortest range. It was during this peak of the storm that disaster struck. A structural support on the human vessel, already weakened by the crash landing, collapsed under the accumulated ice weight. The section containing the primary environmental control system was crushed, sending temperatures plummeting throughout the ship. "Emergency evacuation to the Laharian vessel," Dylan ordered, knowing they had minutes at most before hypothermia set in. "Bring only essential survival gear." The journey between ships, normally a 30-minute walk, became a desperate struggle against both time and nature. The human crew, 27 souls carrying their injured on makeshift stretchers, fought through white oblivion with only a guide rope and emergency beacons to mark their path. When they finally reached the Laharian ship, they found the outer airlock open and waiting, but the scene inside was hardly more promising. The Laharians had congregated in the central command center, the only section of the ship still maintaining temperatures high enough for their survival. The cold-blooded species had slowed dramatically, their movements sluggish, their normally vibrant scales dulled to a listless gray. A reactor cooling has failed, Vizara reported, her speech noticeably slurred. Containment holding, but environmental systems cannot compensate for external temperature. Dylan quickly assessed the situation. The Laharians needed heat, more than their systems could provide. The humans needed shelter from the structural collapse of their own vessel. Neither could survive alone. Initiate emergency shutdown of both reactors, he ordered. We'll restart once the storm passes. That leaves us with only emergency power, Ivy pointed out. Not enough to maintain adequate heat. I know, Dylan said grimly. We'll have to improvise. What followed was the most surreal night in either species' contact history. Humans and Laharians huddled together in the command center, all available emergency heaters deployed in a circle around them. As the ambient temperature continued to drop, the Laharians grew increasingly torpid, their cold-blooded metabolism unable to generate sufficient internal heat. They're dying, Dr. Mayhew reported quietly to Dylan as she checked the vital signs of a particularly still Laharian engineer. Their core temperature is dropping below sustainable levels. Dylan looked across the room to where Vizara sat with her eyes half closed, her normally fluid movements reduced to occasional twitches. Making his decision, he moved to her side and knelt down. Your people need heat, he said simply, and we can provide it. Vizara's eyes opened fully with visible effort. Explain. Humans are endothermic, warm-blooded. We generate body heat. If your people are willing to accept direct physical contact, we can share that heat. The implications hung in the air between them. Physical proximity between predator species was taboo for good reason. It triggered instinctual aggression responses, dominance behaviors that could spiral into violence. What Dylan was proposing went against everything both their cultures had established about interspecies protocol. Vizara was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving from Dylan to the increasingly immobile members of her pack. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. We accept. The arrangement was awkward at first, painfully so. Humans tentatively positioned themselves beside Laharian crew members, their natural body heat creating islands of warmth in the freezing command center. Both species maintained a rigid formality, touching only where absolutely necessary. Gazes carefully averted, but as the hours passed and core temperatures began to stabilize, the desperate nature of their situation eroded cultural barriers. By the third hour, humans and Laharians had formed mixed groups of 3 or 4, huddled together under thermal blankets. The humans in the center providing heat, the larger Laharians on the outside offering protection from the occasional icy drafts that penetrated the ship's damaged hull. Dylan found himself back to back with Vizara, a position that would have been unthinkable days earlier. He could feel the subtle shift as her metabolism slowly responded to the borrowed warmth, her breathing deepening, the tension in her powerful frame gradually relaxing. Your species continues to confound expectation, she said quietly, her voice carrying only to his ears. This sharing of heat, on my world, such vulnerability would be exploited without hesitation. Earth has its share of predators too, Dylan replied. But we learned long ago that cooperation often produces better survival outcomes than competition. A counterintuitive strategy, but effective. Look around. Vizara turned her head slightly, surveying the mixed groups of humans and Laharians now sleeping peacefully despite the desperate conditions. Her inner eyelids flickered in what Dylan was beginning to recognize as thoughtful consideration. Perhaps, she conceded, though I question whether such cooperation can extend beyond survival necessity. That, Dylan said, is exactly what someone wanted to determine by stranding us here. The storm lasted 2 full days, during which the impromptu alliance between humans and Laharians deepened from necessity into something approaching genuine camaraderie. Nick Vulov taught several Laharian engineers the rules of poker, using machine parts as betting tokens. Lieutenant Ivy discovered a shared interest in tactical simulations with Karn. Even Dr. Mayhew found common ground with the Laharian medical officer regarding the surprisingly similar biochemistry of their species. When the winds finally subsided and they were able to restore power to both vessels, the process of disentanglement was almost regretful. As repair teams from both species worked to stabilize the ship's systems, Dylan and Vizara met once more in the neutral ground between vessels. Long-range communications remain non-functional, Vizara reported. But reactor containment is stable, and we have sufficient life support for approximately 15 day cycles. Our navigation system is partially restored, Dylan added. Enough to calculate a trajectory toward the nearest shipping lane. At sublight speeds, we should intercept traffic within 12 days. A moment of silence fell between them. Not the tense, wary silence of their first meeting, but something more complicated, more meaningful. The Grand Council will expect a report on this incident, Vizara said finally. They will want to know which species proved dominant. Dylan's mouth quirked in a small smile. And what will you tell them? Vizara's head tilted, her amber eyes reflecting the crystalline landscape around them. I am uncertain. The traditional metrics of dominance seem inadequate to describe what transpired here. Maybe that's the point, Dylan suggested. Maybe whoever arranged this situation wanted to force us both to reconsider those metrics entirely. A dangerous proposition. The galactic hierarchy is built upon clear lines of dominance and submission. Is it working? Dylan asked bluntly. This hierarchy? Because from humanity's perspective, it seems to produce an awful lot of conflict for a system supposedly designed to prevent it. Vizara's inner eyelids flickered rapidly, a sign of intense thought. Dylan had learned. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new timbre, one he hadn't heard before. When we reach the shipping lanes and establish contact, she said, we will be required to appear before the Grand Council to explain our survival. They will expect a traditional resolution between our species. One must bow, Dylan said, quoting the unspoken rule that had governed predator-species interactions for generations. Yes, Vizara's gaze was steady on his. But perhaps there are forms of acknowledgement that transcend simple dominance. With deliberate slowness, Vizara lowered herself into a crouch, not a submissive posture, but a protective one, similar to how her species might guard a valued pack member. Dylan, understanding the significance of the gesture, unholstered his sidearm and placed it on the ground between them. Then, equally deliberately, he extended his hand, palm open. For a moment, neither moved. Then Vizara extended one 6-fingered hand and, with infinite care, placed it in Dylan's. Contact. Trust. A new beginning. The Grand Council Hall on Celestis Phi hummed with tension as the memory faded, and Dylan found himself once again facing Vizara across the polished floor. The assembled delegates watched with bated breath, awaiting the inevitable dominance display that tradition demanded when two Deathworld species met in formal council. Grimmich stepped forward, mandibles clicking nervously. As is customary, the representatives of Earth and Laharia will now establish protocol hierarchy for these proceedings. Dylan felt Lieutenant Ivy shift beside him, her body tense with anticipation. Nick Vulov muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Here we go again." The hall fell silent as Vizara stepped forward, her powerful frame commanding immediate attention. The various delegations, Zari, Avon, Virex, Sinian, Corfax, leaned forward, eager to witness which of these dangerous species would establish supremacy. What happened next would be recorded in council archives and debated for generations to come. With fluid grace, Vizara lowered herself to one knee before Dylan, bowing her head in a gesture unmistakable to every species present. Submission. The collective gasp from the assembled delegates was audible, a rush of sound like wind through leaves. But before anyone could process this unprecedented act, Dylan stepped forward and, to the absolute horror of the council, reached out to stroke the top of Vizara's head, his fingers gently tracing the pattern of scales along her crest. Grimmick made a strangled sound of distress. This is not. The protocols do not. The protocols, Dylan said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the hall, are precisely why we're here today. Vizara rose to her full height, towering above Dylan, yet somehow no longer projecting the aura of menace that had accompanied her entrance. Together, they turned to face the stunned council. 3 standard cycles ago, Vizara began, her harmonics pitched to formal address. A human research vessel and a Laharian patrol ship were forced down on the ice world designated MK-130. Both vessels were disabled by the same weapon signature. Both crews were left to die in an environment hostile to both our species. Someone, Dylan continued, wanted to see what would happen when humans and Laharians met with no witnesses and no escape. Someone with significant technical resources and access to classified patrol routes. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Only certain council members would have had such access. What happened, Vizara said, was not what anyone expected. Over the next hour, Dylan and Vizara recounted the events on MK-130, the initial suspicion, the pragmatic alliance, the reactor crisis, the storm that had forced them into closest proximity. As they spoke, the atmosphere in the council hall gradually shifted from shock to fascination. "Don't forget the plant," Nick called out at one point, drawing confused looks from the delegates. Dylan smiled. "Ah, yes, the plant. One of our botanists had been transporting a rare specimen, a heat-producing plant from the Amazon basin on Earth. During the worst of the storm, we placed it at the center of our huddle. It provided just enough additional thermal energy to keep the most critically injured Laharians alive. The humans called it taking turns being the potato," Vizara added, her harmonics carrying an undertone that the translation software struggled to render before settling on fond amusement. The council delegates exchanged bewildered glances. The casual interaction between human and Laharian defied every established protocol for predator species. "When our ships were finally rescued," Dylan continued, "we agreed to report the basic facts of our survival, but to withhold certain details until we could present them directly to the full council. What you have witnessed today," Vizara said, her amber gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates, "is not submission. It is acknowledgement, recognition of a truth our peoples discovered on MK-130, that strength can be found in vulnerability, and that true power comes not from domination but from mutual respect." Grimmage, who had been standing frozen in apparent shock, finally found his voice. "This is unprecedented," he managed. "The protocols for Deathworld species interaction have been established for millennia. They cannot simply be rewritten." "Can't they?" Dylan asked mildly. "The current system has produced 3 interspecies conflicts in the past decade alone. Perhaps it's time to consider alternatives. The Laharian packs," Vizara added, "have lost 37 ships and over 4,000 lives to territorial disputes in that same period. Our traditional approach clearly has limitations." A murmur ran through the assembled delegates as they processed these statements. It was the Zari representative who finally broke the tension. her translucent form pulsing with thoughtful colors. "If I understand correctly," she said, her voice rendered in the delicate tones characteristic of her species, "you are proposing a fundamental revision to Council protocol regarding predator-species interaction." "We are proposing," Dylan said carefully, "a framework for Deathworld cooperation based on mutual vulnerability rather than dominance hierarchy." "Impossible," snapped the Virex delegate, his chromatophores flashing agitation patterns. "Predator species cannot coexist without established dominance. Evolutionary psychology is quite clear on this point." "And yet," Vizara countered, gesturing to the human delegation, "here we stand." What followed was the most contentious council debate in recent memory. Traditional factions argued vehemently against any change to the established order. Progressive elements saw opportunity in the human Laharian proposal. Throughout it all, Dylan and Vizara stood side by side, a living demonstration of their argument. Lieutenant Ivy, watching from the sidelines, leaned toward Nick. "Think they'll go for it?" "Not a chance," Nick replied, though his expression was hopeful rather than cynical. "But they'll remember this. Sometimes you plant seeds knowing you won't see the harvest." The debate continued for hours, cycling through legal precedents, evolutionary theory, and practical politics. Finally, as the station's environmental system shifted toward evening cycle, Council Leader Threaxin of the Cinean Collective raised her appendages for silence. "We have heard arguments from all sides," she announced, her bioluminescent patterns indicating formal declaration. "While the Council cannot immediately implement such a significant protocol change without further study, we acknowledge the compelling nature of the evidence presented by the Earth and Laharian delegations." She paused, her patterns shifting to what Dylan recognized as careful consideration. "Therefore, we hereby establish a provisional framework for a Deathworld cooperation initiative to be developed jointly by representatives from Earth and the Laharian Pax, with oversight from neutral Council observers." It wasn't complete victory, but it was a beginning. As the session adjourned, delegates approached the human and Laharian representatives with a mixture of curiosity and cautious interest. Questions were asked, contact information exchanged, diplomatic doors opened that had previously been firmly closed. "Well," Dylan said quietly to Vizara as they watched the council hall gradually empty, "that went better than expected." "Indeed," she agreed, her inner eyelids flickering with what he now recognized as satisfaction. "Though I suspect our troubles are just beginning, whoever orchestrated our crash landing on MK-130 will not be pleased with this outcome." "No," Dylan conceded, "but they miscalculated fundamentally." "How so?" Dylan smiled, remembering the frozen wasteland where enemies had become allies, where survival had forged something entirely new. "They assumed that when predators meet, one must dominate. They never considered that we might choose to form a pack instead." As the lights of the council hall dimmed for evening cycle, Dylan and Vizara remained, seated side by side at the central table. Around them, their respective teams mingled comfortably. Lieutenant Ivy deep in tactical discussion with Karn, Nick Vulov demonstrating some Earth card game to fascinated Laharian engineers, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable months before. Vizara leaned slightly against Dylan's shoulder, her head tilting to touch his. He responded in kind, the contact comfortable, familiar. "Do you think it will last?" she asked, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "This alliance, once we return to our respective worlds?" Dylan considered the question seriously. "I think," he said finally, "that we've proven something important, not just to the Council, but to ourselves. When two Deathworld species meet, dominance isn't the only possible outcome. And the alternative? Vizara prompted, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Dylan smiled, his hand rising to stroke the scales along her crest in the gesture that had so scandalized the council. The alternative is understanding that true strength lies not in forcing others to bow, but in choosing to stand together. Outside the viewport, the stars of 1,000 worlds glittered against the void, each one home to species with their own evolutionary history, their own instincts and fears and hopes. Somewhere among those stars, someone had orchestrated a confrontation between predators, expecting blood and dominance. Instead, they had created something entirely new, a future where Deathworld species might recognize each other not as rivals, but as kin.